In the last session, we introduced the idea that the early neural tube initially develops three swellings, becoming these three major areas, the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. And in this session, we'll now take a little bit more of a look at the structures within each of these three major regions. As we noted, the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It's the seat of our thoughts and perceptions and our voluntary actions. We also mentioned that the word cortex, which is often misused to mean cerebrum, is actually the surface layer of grey matter. The surface area of the brain is increased by its many folds, called gyri, which are separated by fissures called sulci, sulcus being the singular. The larger of these sulci are structures that then subdivide the overall cerebrum and cortex into frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes that are seen easily from the surface of the brain here. If we were to open up this very deep lateral fissure here, we would also find an additional fifth lobe called the insula. Many areas of the cortex can be assigned specific functions, such as vision or somatic sensation. The so-called Brodmann areas refer to specific brain areas with particular functions. However, there are large areas of cortex that we cannot assign specific functions in that straightforward way, and these we refer to as association cortex. These are the areas involved in interpretation and meaning of sensory information, formation of intentions, and the so-called higher functions of the mind. The lower part of the forebrain, shaded here in light blue, is called the diencephalon, and that consists of the thalamus plus the hypothalamus. The thalamus is an egg-shaped structure, and it serves as a relay station through which each of the sensory pathways for somatic sensation, vision, and hearing will synapse as they travel to the cortex. The sensory pathways in each side of the thalamus continue to the cerebral hemisphere in the same side of the body, but convey information from the opposite side of the body. And so, as we'll see in those pathways, they've already crossed over to the other side by the time they reach the thalamus. The hypothalamus here is this small area ventral to the thalamus. The hypothalamus is a command center for the autonomic nervous system, as well as much of the endocrine system, through its regulation here of the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus, in addition, is a source of several basic motivational drives such as hunger, thirst, and sex. The brain contains extensive white matter formed by myelinated axons. In this coronal section here, we can see there's a major band of white matter on each side, referred to as the internal capsule, and this is carrying fibers running between the thalamus and the cortex. The internal capsule there is continuous in the cerebrum with the cortical white matter, and this mostly consists of interneurons communicating between cortical neurons. One obvious anatomical area where the interneurons pass is called the corpus callosum, and these are fibers that are connecting the left and right sides. On this coronal section, we just see a little slice through it here, passing from left to right. If we look back on the median sagittal section here and looking at the medial surface, we can see that the corpus callosum here is actually a very extensive connection of interneurons going back and forth between the left and right halves of the brain. Turning back to the coronal section here below, we can also see lateral to the thalamus, there are some fairly large collections of grey matter deep in the brain, and these are referred to as the deep cerebral nuclei or the basal ganglia. They include the caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus, and we'll be talking about these large collections of grey matter when we talk about the motor system. There are some other forebrain structures we'll also get to later. In the temporal lobe, we have some important structures, the amygdala and hippocampus, which are important in learning and memory. And the first two cranial nerves, the olfactory and optic systems, are also derivatives of the forebrain. This slide shows some sequential horizontal sections moving down from the midbrain through into the hindbrain. The midbrain is a narrow region. It's part of the brain stem, and it's a conduit for all of the nerve tracts that are passing between the forebrain and the hindbrain. The dorsal side is referred to as the tectum, and in this section here it passes through two obvious swellings on the dorsal side, known as the superior colliculi. The superior colliculus on each side is a very important relay station in control of the eye. If we were to take another horizontal section just caudal to this, we would find another pair of swellings, the inferior colliculi, and it turns out that these are really important relay stations for the auditory, the hearing system. The ventral part of the midbrain is referred to as the tegmentum, or sometimes the cerebral peduncles, because essentially the cerebrum is attached to the brainstem and all the fibers are running up and down through these systems here. A couple of additional important structures found in the midbrain are the red nucleus and substantia nigra. We'll talk about these when we get to the motor system. Moving down further on in the brainstem, we pass into the hindbrain structures. And if you look at the rostral half of the hindbrain, the structures here form the pons and the cerebellum. We have a whole session later on the cerebellum. It's not shown here, but it has two hemispheres like the cerebrum, and these are connected by a midline region called the vermis. It's physically connected to the brainstem actually by three peduncles, a superior, middle, and an inferior peduncle, and this particular section in the middle of the pons here has gone through the middle cerebellar peduncle. The cerebellum has critical functions in coordinating movement, and it receives an enormous number of axons from the forebrain and from the spinal cord. Descending inputs from the forebrain relay information about the intentions for movement, while the ascending inputs from the spinal cord are relaying information about the position of the body in space. And the cerebellum will then determine the correct sequence of muscle contractions that are needed to coordinate accurate movements. An obvious anatomical feature of the pons, if you look at the ventral surface of the pons, is this large bulge that occurs. And that prominent structure results from a massive number of transverse pontine fibers. What's going on here is we have fibers crossing from one side to the other, because most of the descending axons from the cortex synapse in the pons here and then cross over to the other side to enter the cerebellum through this middle cerebellar peduncle. Some other structures in the pons we'll discuss later on include the cavity of the fourth ventricle, part of the ventricular system, some more cranial nerve nuclei in here, and also some deep structures in the brain referred to as the reticular formation that are important in things like wakefulness and consciousness. Moving down into the most caudal part of the brainstem, we have the medulla, and this connects to the pons above and the spinal cord below. One of the more notable features of the medulla anteriorly are two prominent swellings, one on each side, referred to as the medullary pyramids here. Each of these pyramids contains a corticospinal or pyramidal tract. We'll talk in more detail about these in later sessions, but these are important tracts traveling from the motor cortex to the spinal cord, carrying axons of motor neurons that command movements. The pyramids exist here because it's the site of decussation, the crossing over of these motor fibers from one side to the other. The next session is the last of our basic overview sessions, where we'll discuss the peripheral nervous system.